Staying in Southeast Asia, ever since its handover in 1997 from Britain to China, Hong Kong has been operating under a one-country, two-system rule. Beijing promised to preserve some of the city's economic and social autonomy from the mainland, including freedom of the press. For a while, Hong Kong enjoyed one of the freest media climates in the region. In 2003, it ranked 18th in the annual Press Freedom Index issued by Reporters Without Borders. However, 10 years later, the climate has changed, and Hong Kong now sits at number 61 in that same table. China is fifth from bottom. China watchers say Beijing is gradually taking control over Hong Kong, and the media are just a part of that. And what was once a haven for free speech is now a dateline where critical journalists are attacked, newspaper editors are self-censoring, and the government in Beijing is being urged to back off. The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on the slow but steady decline of press freedom in Hong Kong.
A gruesome scene on the streets of Hong Kong. On February 26th, Kevin Lau, a veteran of Hong Kong's journalistic corps, was attacked by two men with a cleaver. 11 people were arrested, but authorities initially ruled out any link to Lau's work as a journalist. From his hospital, Lau said he strongly disagreed with the Hong Kong police.
希望匯聚社會各界嘅力量，促請警方早日破案，令新聞工作者可以對法治重拾信心，無需恐懼暴力威脅。
6 weeks before the attack, he had been removed as editor of the muckraking newspaper Ming Pao. His replacement was known to have pro-Beijing sympathies. According to other journalists in Hong Kong, the attack on Lau had everything to do with his journalism.
I cannot simply think of any personal reasons that can justify the attack. He's financially stable, he has a happy family, and all we can think about is what he has done and what Ming Pao has done. Ming Pao is one of the few independent voices in Hong Kong, and it's really famous of its investigative reports.
One could say you could not link this incident to press freedom, but all these coincidences added together will make Hong Kong journalists very worried that whether or not their freedom to report and to comment without fear has been eroded.
While editing Ming Pao, Lau collaborated in an investigation that revealed the hidden offshore assets of some of China's ruling elite. That story was published in January. Lau was fired within a month. To most of his colleagues, it was clear the investigation touched a nerve. The situation is so sensitive that people are reluctant to talk about it on camera, and those that do want their anonymity preserved.
This attack shouldn't be seen in isolation. It's just the latest in a series of attacks that have steadily eroded press freedom. It's come to a point when journalists are really hoping that authorities in Hong Kong or Beijing will give them a guarantee that journalists will be protected and that this won't keep happening.
Media workers have reason to be nervous. Last year alone, the Hong Kong Journalists Association recorded at least 6 attacks on the media, including the storming of the offices of Next Media, a company known for its cutting-edge animation, and an assault on Chen Ping, the publisher of political weekly Ice and Affairs. Then there are the journalists pushed out of their jobs, like Li Wei-ling, an outspoken radio host who says she was removed from her job for criticising governments in China and Hong Kong. But there are other issues media watchers are concerned about. Large parts of Hong Kong's media are owned by business tycoons with ties to the mainland. Richard Lee is the owner of the Hong Kong Economic Journal. His father, Li Ka-shing, is one of the most influential businessmen in China. Malaysian billionaire Robert Kwok owns the South China Morning Post and has huge investments in China. Analysts say such relationships with the mainland have had an impact on the independence of media in Hong Kong. Another way Beijing is changing the media landscape is by inserting political allies within news outlets. The South China Morning Post has been a Hong Kong institution since 1903 and the city's leading English-language newspaper. In 2012, the paper appointed its first editor from the mainland, Wang Jingwei.
It is reasonable for people to speculate whether his background and his political inclination will be very much pro-China to the extent that he may not be an independent editor. But on the other hand, of course, he's also a journalist by profession. He has a lot of experience, so one can never pin down on whether the move is a politically motivated one.
Since Jiang Wei has been editor, the situation has worsened. The most spectacular incident was of the coverage of a blind dissident who died in suspicious circumstances on the mainland. The story was meant to run quite prominently on South China Morning Post, but it was cut down to a nib and pushed to the back pages. A senior editor who questioned that decision was told by Wang that he didn't have to explain anything to him, and if he didn't like it, he could leave. It raised concerns and protests outside the office.
There is certainly a tightening of media control. It comes in the form of self-censorship and also some direct interference from Beijing officials in Hong Kong. In some cases, we've seen pages dictated by Beijing officials. Photos were added, headlines were changed, and some interview ideas were barred, and certain people were told not to speak to them.
But that's not how Hong Kong officials describe it. Starry Lee is both a member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong and part of a pro-Beijing political party.
Hong Kong is still the heaven for media, and media are also free to say anything they want. If it is a censorship, it is the organization itself who decide. We can see every day, every program, they look at issue from different angles. Some criticize the government heavily, some will support the government in the way that Chinese government work. From my observation, Hong Kong's media do have basically full freedom in expressing their view.
But Beijing critics argue that wasn't the case during the 2012 election. According to a report in the South China Morning Post, the propaganda chief of China's representative agency in Hong Kong called the owner of the daily Hong Kong Economic Journal to complain about its critical coverage of the city's recently elected leader, Leng Chunying.
It seemed that the phone call worked because I know several senior journalists at Hong Kong Economic Journal, and they say still 2 years later, they're just basically more careful than they were in the past about being critical of the government. And that's very worrying that one phone call can make such a big impact.
I don't think there is concrete evidence saying that. From all these situations or from all these things happen in Hong Kong, I can conclude that we still enjoy a freedom of expression and media still enjoys a high degrees of autonomies.
When Hong Kong was returned to the Chinese 17 years ago, there were all kinds of concerns about how the city would change. Those changes are now happening. For decades, the Hong Kong media provided one of the few windows outsiders had into the China story. Beijing hasn't quite slammed that window shut, but it is closing. The proof is right there, in black and white.